Okay, I have a few minutes here before I have to go to work, so I'll try to do another installment on this. So this is the second installment of Ma vie en Aspie, my life in Asperger's. I don't know. Anyway, okay, so this is part two, going on directly from part one. I had a nymphomaniac roommate who kept having her boyfriends over, and I would hear them going at it through the wall. This was distressing to me. I had absolutely no understanding of sex at that time, although I pretended to be very sophisticated. I had never associated sex with my crush princes. I was getting very little sleep and was weighing in at about 100 pounds. I was 5'7" and I had lost about 60 pounds during all the dieting. As the end of the year approached, I suddenly began eating everything in sight. I had some kind of breakdown and checked myself into the hospital for a few days. I copped out of all my end-of-year performances and quit school. I felt that all was over unless I could just get back to my original music school where I felt most comfortable. Miraculously, I was allowed to return there to their college division. I had a good year and gave a very good recital, but things began to go kind of downhill when I found I was starting to hate to practice. I'd also gained a large amount of weight back. My former accompanist crush guy was still there, now with an extraordinarily beautiful girlfriend. I was getting really depressed, and I quit school. I moved in with my mother, who was playing viola professionally at that time. I stayed in bed day after day until finally she had had enough and said she was taking me to be evaluated for medication. I began taking dizipramine, and 10 days later I could no longer remain in bed. I had a lot of side effects, but a huge weight was lifted from my chest, so I remained on the medicine. Then my mother told me I would have to work, so I practiced my typing skills for a while and went to a temp agency. This marked the beginning of my working life. By this time, I had gained about 80 pounds, going up to 180 from the 100 pounds I had proudly reached at that prestigious music school. It was hard to practice flute and work at the same time, since I could no longer fit in my 4 to 5 hours of warm-up. I started going to a gym, somewhat normalized my weight, and got my first full-time job. I moved out of my mother's into my own apartment after a couple of years. I was still doing some flute playing, but my level of playing had dropped. I loved the gym, as long as it wasn't some class where one had to follow along with movements. Sometimes I would spend 3 to 4 hours at the gym lifting weights and riding a stationary bike. In 1984, I went to South America to play in the only professional orchestra I ever happened to get into. Unfortunately, that only lasted about 9 months because the government was changing and they stopped funding most of the orchestras there. I went back to my city and started office work again. Gradually, I quit flute entirely. I had been reading self-help books since my bout with major depression and began to follow my interest in psychology. I was beginning to see that there were alternatives to being a musician. When I was 27, a friend and I took a summer intro to psych class. I had never really studied for school before, but now I was finding it to be fun and a challenge. Then I took intro to philosophy and kept going to school at night until I graduated with a BA in psych in 1989. I had a GPA of 3.9. I tended to apply all of the theories to myself as I studied, which over time seemed to increase my level of insight. I also had some therapy, starting with a bodywork person who a work friend had referred me to. I went to her for a couple of years, but did not really get that much out of it. Finally, I told her that I thought going over and over my unpleasant feelings just made them more of a pattern, and I did not believe in the premise of catharsis anymore. She sent me to a cognitive behavioral therapist, with whom I received some good insights. Then I became entranced with Jungian psychology for a while and went to a Jungian analyst, which, although entertaining, was pretty much completely useless. While studying psychology, I worked on a volunteer suicide hotline for a while and as a part-time mental health worker on a locked psych unit. By then, I had a new goal. I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. So I applied to 30-plus programs for clinical psych. I had a 700 on the GRE verbal, 570 on the analytic, 550 on the quantitative, and a 750 on the psych subject test. I also had an 84 on the Miller analogies test. I was granted only one interview, which did not go well. I ended up signing up for a local counselor training program, but I found it boring and repetitive. It was very similar to what I had already studied, and I just didn't see myself repeating all that work. So I decided to do pre-med, since I had also developed a lot of interest in science and medicine, and I was interested in psychiatry. I finished pre-med sometime around 1990 and applied to 20-plus medical schools. On the MCAT, I had a 9 on the verbal, 9 on the biological sciences, 10 on the physical sciences, and an R on the writing sample. I had 7 interviews and received no acceptances. Casting around for alternatives, eventually I was accepted to an experimental psych program back in my original home state in 1995. I probably should have known not to go back there. This was a very strange and unpleasant experience for me, kind of Rod Serling-esque. I'm not normally paranoid, but I became paranoid there, so much so that my hands would shake if I had to write in front of anyone, even say at the bank. In a nutshell, possibly because I was an older student, maybe because of Asperger's, I felt I was being looked at strangely all the time. The teacher I was TAing for seemed weirded out by me, maybe since I was a good decade or more older than she was. Even now, I'm not entirely sure what the problem was, but it was major and pervasive. They had some kind of get-acquainted party for the grad students and faculty, and I ended up sneaking out of the backyard through a hole in the hedge and walking back to my apartment in waves of relief. They also had things like bake sales that one was supposed to participate in, but I did not want to spend my time that way, and it got in the way of my studying. I needed to spend a lot of time studying in order to feel comfortable with the material. The only thing I really enjoyed there was my weekly stint in the computer room, helping relatively non-computer illiterate students use the computers. The final kicker came when the statistics teacher began a new and difficult topic and said he did not want us taking any notes, just listening to what he said. Then he proceeded to explain whatever it was very fast, with his voice falling off at the ends of sentences, and finally said, "This material is not in any current book." I was completely dependent upon my notes and writing everything down and going over it in my own way, and realized that I had completely missed the information. I searched the internet for that book to no avail. Later, I tried to ask my classmates to help me, but they were too busy. I went by the statistics teacher's office to ask for help, and he essentially refused as well. This was when I began to realize that I was leaving. Things had gone from merely unpleasant to completely impossible. I had to attend a test on the subject matter he had covered, and I turned in a blank sheet. Completely separately from this, right before I was going to leave, I watched one of the former students give her thesis presentation and field questions from the faculty. She was extraordinary. I realized I would never have the presence of mind to do something like that anyway, so I was definitely going to leave. Another thing that clinched it was that the physio-psych teacher wanted me to do something with testing Alzheimer's patients at various sites, and that would be impossible because I could not drive. An odd aside, according to the physio-psych teacher, something eerily similar had happened to an older female student who had been there the previous year, and she disappeared. I hightailed it back to my city of choice, began temping in offices again, and fortunately fell into medical transcription. A few years back, I did take another stab at a graduate program, actually a radiographic technologist program, but I was not physically well at the time due to long-standing problems with menorrhagia and endometriosis. I also found that I had a lot of trouble dealing with the equipment, moving, aiming, etc., so I quit the program.